Hello, my name is Will Loxley. I'm an undergraduate student at the University of Utah, graduating with a Bachelor's of Science in Game Development, focusing on game production and games user research. I'm grateful to represent the U's Entertainment Arts and Engineering program here at the 2023 Utah Conference on Undergraduate Research. I care deeply for the games industry, and I aspire to improve the practical realities of people within it. I am also disabled. And as a disabled prospective developer on the cusp of entering the industry, the current state of recruitment is particularly relevant to me. I realized I could not be the only disabled person feeling discouraged about my potential being artificially limited in a competitive and demanding job market. This research, titled Disabled, Not Disqualified, Ableism in Recruitment and Retention for Game Development, documents how game companies publicly and actively recruit disabled people as candidates for the next generation of the games industry. Game development careers are widely regarded as turbulent or intense due to a consistent reliance on periods of compulsory overtime, otherwise known as crunch. Developers who crunch are affected in quantifiably detrimental ways, including psychosomatic health issues and decreased work satisfaction. Nevertheless, the International Game Developers Association, or IGDA, reports that recent use of crunch has nearly doubled in just 2 years. Crunch has been a popular topic of study in the 2000s. However, despite disabled individuals being especially vulnerable to this harmful labor practice, the interactions between crunch and disabled developers are significantly underexplored. Critical disability studies coined the social model of disability, where individuals are disabled by a societal context rather than a physical or mental condition. So, a disabling situation is the specific societal context in which an individual is disabled. According to the IGDA, 25% of professional game developers self-report as having a disability. If a quarter of developers disclose a disabled identity and are regularly exposed to extreme and demanding working conditions, there is then a substantial risk for disabling situations to occur in the games industry. Game development is a field of product design and has been defined as a creative collaborative practice. Technical and creative disciplines regularly interact to deliver quality products, often under extreme project management constraints. The disciplines involved are progressively refined as new cohorts of developers attempt to improve and remain active in the industry. So, maintaining developer careers is vital to the overall health of this high commitment and high involvement industry, particularly for underemployed communities. Several marginalized communities qualify as underemployed in the games industry. However, the overwhelming majority of research in game spaces directed toward disability pertain to front-end digital accessibility. And research on equitable product design and digital games labor has trended toward focusing on non-disabled working lives. As a consequence, there is dramatically less research on ableism compared to other instances of minority discrimination. While interpersonal interactions in work environments can be discriminatory, disabled people also experience ableism when interacting with inaccessible systems related to human resources and recruitment. Inaccessible recruitment practices can be characterized as microaggressive and operate under key assumptions. 1, a candidate is obviously able-bodied, and 2, they would disclose being disabled. 3, a candidate is or will be perceived by coworkers as productive. And 4, a candidate is not or will not be perceived by coworkers as a distinct or separate category of worker. Likewise, an employer assumes they are or would be more interested in employing a disabled candidate than fellow employers. Game companies are vulnerable to these assumptions. And even if a game company were to avoid these key assumptions, recruitment practices may fail to account for invisible disabilities, such as cognitive disabilities and chronic illness. As we continue to survive a global pandemic and mass disabling event, inaccessible recruitment practices will prevent more and more candidates from succeeding in the games industry. This is a problem, but not an insurmountable problem. Consumer-focused disciplines iterate in the pursuit of a final shippable product, such as the design discipline of games user experience. How we hire, how we maintain developer careers, should be no different. They should follow a similar pattern of iteration and improvement. And yet, industry norms of secrecy and a limited information flow have led to little being publicly available regarding the accessibility of a day in the life of a game developer. My intention behind the direction of this research is to illustrate the level of consideration for disabled candidates by game companies, including those that comparatively excel in considering other marginalized identities. When designing this research, I suspected that disabled people were not being sufficiently equipped to successfully enter and succeed in the games industry. I wanted to investigate if game company recruitment efforts operate under the incorrect assumption that recruitment is an inherently neutral or objective practice, rather than a field subject to immense bias in companies' search for their ideal candidate. Because my personal experience is pertinent here, I conducted an institutional ethnography. This research ethnographically centers disabled game developers through the analysis of 20 game companies' public-facing documentation. This was done via document analysis to determine if disabled people are excluded from being talent recruitment. Data was collected in the form of compiling screenshots and excerpts from game company websites. This study qualifies a game company website as a career hub or page. The order in which I navigated pages and collected data was directly informed by each site's layout. The intent was to follow the perceived intended user experience flow of the website. As a member of these websites' intended audience, my perception may be salient and should be reflected in the results. Now, data was organized under 5 classifications. Taglines were identified as mission or vision statements. This is an example of a tagline from Blizzard Entertainment. It reads, "We're on a quest, bring our dreams to life and craft the most epic entertainment experiences ever." There were also equal opportunity disclosures, or EODs. These were identified by legal employment notices. This is an excerpt from Activision Blizzard. There were also core values. Core values were identified by we action statements, such as we value or we hold. This is an excerpt from the game company King, and it reads, "We are seriously playful. We balance art and science. We are supportive but demanding in everything we do." There were also culture statements. Culture statements were identified as taglines, which emphasize recruitment. These are typically internally focused. And here's an excerpt from Electronic Arts. This states that we celebrate diversity of thought, cultural differences, lifestyle, age, background, experience, religion, economic and social status, gender identity, and marital status, among other aspects. There were also the last category, which were closers. Closers are identified as information placed immediately before or nearby website elements that redirect to job listings. This is a closer from Epic Games. It reads, "Be epic," and then follows, "Contribute to the unrelenting focus on innovation, quality, and community that defines us." Through thematic document analysis, there were 4 prevailing themes throughout the 20 companies I examined. The first theme was recruiter info. This asked if the company website directed applicants to recruiter information, including an email, Twitter, company LinkedIn. For junior developers like myself, applying to a position without contacting a recruiter can be a fruitless endeavor. So, do game companies connect candidates to this necessary information? Recruiter information was present for 11 out of 20 game companies. Next was DEI values. This asked if statements of company culture specified DEI-oriented values. DEI-oriented is defined as something directed toward conventional benefactors of diversity, equity, and inclusion practices, including marginalized identities such as Black, Brown, Indigenous, Asian folks, etc., queer, trans, gender nonconforming, etc., and disabled, neurodiverse, etc. Now, 12 out of 20 companies specified DEI-oriented values. Then there were DEI examples. This asked if companies do specify DEI-oriented values, do they provide examples of these values in practice? This can include employee resource groups, or ERGs, as well as company DEI reports. If a company specified DEI-oriented values, they also provided examples. So the same 12 out of 20 companies provided examples of DEI-oriented values in practice. And finally, there was disability specified. This asked if companies provide examples of DEI-oriented values in practice and if disability is specified in those examples. And only 7 out of 20 game companies specifically referenced disability. And all 4 of these themes were present for only 2 game company websites, 2 out of 20. As predicted, game companies specifically addressing disabled developers is uncommon. Where other marginalized identities are frequently accounted for, disabled candidates are ignored. A follow-up analysis of these themes' prevalence is revealing. If we ignore websites which simply direct applicants to a company linked in, rather than offer more immediate channels of communication like an email, only 6 out of 20 game companies provided any recruiter information. Then if we ignore game companies that exclusively reference ERGs, 9 out of 20 companies, down from 12, provided examples of DEI-oriented values in practice. And once again, if we ignore game companies that exclusively referenced ERGs, only 1 out of 20 game companies provided examples of active support specifically for disabled candidates. Only 1. Of the 20 companies examined, 4 belonged to the same parent company, Activision Blizzard King, or ABK. Activision Blizzard, Blizzard Entertainment, and King all have separate websites, each offering varying information. Despite being subsidiary websites and directing candidates to the same information, the availability of that information is inconsistent. Are candidates interested in positions specific to one of these companies meant to examine all of these websites? If not, how are candidates meant to access all of this information otherwise? This inconsistency harms the potential success of candidates in general, but is compounded for disabled candidates. We do not all have the same 24 hours in a day. The energy required to apply to these companies is not equal across non-disabled and disabled people. Overall, disabled candidates seem to be widely disregarded by game companies. At best, internal retention resources like employee resource groups are available. At worst, game companies provide no information whatsoever regarding DEI and accessibility in their daily operations. Not to mention, internal retention resources only support current employees. They don't extend to interested applicants. By locking assistance for disabled developers behind closed doors, the majority of game companies reveal their bias and support my suspicion that recruitment is assumed to be a neutral or objective practice. When applying to positions at many game companies, candidates are asked to voluntarily disclose details of their identity. This includes their race, gender, military veteran status, and disability status. As a disabled game developer on the cusp of entering the industry, I am in a unique position. In conducting this research and in being involved in developer communities, I am very aware of early career recruitment in the games industry. And after examining game companies, I can confidently say I do not feel comfortable disclosing my identity as a disabled person when applying to game development positions. Company values surrounding developer accessibility do not seem to be prioritized, and as a result, disabled developers do not seem welcome in the industry. If a fellow game development student asked me if they should flag themselves as disabled for an application, I would advise them not to. And to be clear, everyone has the capacity to become disabled. I'll say that again. Every single person, including any non-disabled person watching this presentation, has the capacity to become disabled. As such, prioritizing accessibility in recruitment has the capacity to benefit every person, disabled or otherwise. Evolving how we hire is essential to the long-term health and success of both the games industry at large, as well as the health and success of disabled professionals. To conclude, I'd like to read this excerpt from the Electronic Arts website. You've already seen this, it should be familiar. We invest in DEI across our business to empower our people, actively foster inclusion in our communities, and shape the future of electronic arts. How does this apply to disabled developers? As of now, I couldn't tell you. Further research may suggest high-level improvements for online game company recruitment practices so as to better represent internal values and bolster the potential pool of applicants. These results may also inform future research on identifying industry norms which negatively affect recruitment and retention for disabled game developers. This work was supported by my mentors and co-authors, Drs. Fernando Rodríguez and Ashley Guajardo. I cannot thank both of them enough for their guidance and assurance throughout this process. This work was also supported through the Undergraduate Research Opportunities Program from the Office of Undergraduate Research at the University of Utah. For any questions, feel free to contact me at my email, wmloxley@gmail.com. That's wmloxley@gmail.com, or through LinkedIn. You can find me at Will Loxley. Thank you for your time.